Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be looking at an endgame with two pawns versus a rook. And these two pawns are about to promote down here to the first rank, turn into whatever they want. From White's standpoint, the rook by itself is not going to be able to hold the fort against these two pawns pushing down here near the first rank here. White is going to need to get his king involved into the game. We're going to look at the optimal lines from both sides, but then also look at some of the suboptimal lines of how things can go wrong for either side of the board. Hopefully this will give you a better idea of how you should be thinking about the endgame when you don't have some concrete ideas on how either side would win. Two pawns and a rook. Clearly White is up in material, but right now, Black has the upper hand because of the immediate threats of these pawns pushing forward to promote. So hopefully you enjoy this video. It's White's move. First thing that we need to do is get the king involved into the game, and that is king to g4. As we said, the rook by itself is not going to be able to hold the forward here. Now, Black has these two passed pawns. You need to push your passed pawns. Now, there's a few instances where you need to develop other material to get them to a position where you can successfully push those pawns, but generally you do want to be pushing those pawns. No different in this example. Black needs to be playing either e2 or d2. We'll look at both of those. First, looking at e2 here, and this is threatening this rook here on f1. So the rook really needs to move here. Now, if there wasn't connected pawn here on d3, then it's usually safe to just play rook to e1. This stops the immediate threat of the pawn pushing forward down to e1, but you can see that this loses to d2. Now it can't be in front of either of these pawns or it's going to lose, and if the rook comes over here to, let's say, a1, then d1 turning into a queen, and there's no way to stop the threat of the pawn pushing down here to e1. If it takes here, the pawn's just going to recapture and turn into a pawn. So that's not going to work. White does have the move after e2 to bring the rook to c1 or to f4. Both of these are going to put the opponent in check, force the king to move, and then depending on where Black moves, has the next move to kind of figure out what option is best. But of the two options, rook to c1 is the better option because it not only attacks the king, but still protects this first rank. Two pawns pushing forward, you still want to make sure that you have all your material protecting this first rank. Now the king is under attack. The most logical move is to play king to d4. Still connected, centralized king, protecting these pawns right here. If the king starts going over to the b file, doesn't make a lot of sense. Completely disconnected from the rest of the pieces here. So king d4, most logical move. And now that the rook on c1 is not under attack, White can continue with the initial theme we talked about, and that is to get the king here on g4 more involved into the game. f3, the immediate move for White here. And now we start to look at Black's options. He can't just play pawn to e1 because that's just going to get captured by the rook on c1. Then we start to look at the king here. The king can't come to e3 or e4 because it's now blocked by the white king here. It can't come to any of the squares on the c file because it's blocked by this rook here on c1. And it doesn't make a lot of sense for the king to move up here on d5 because then just king to e3, and that stops all the threats that Black has, and now Black is actually going to lose this game. So the only real threat that Black has to continue is d2, and that is a very real threat here because that puts a lot of pressure on White's, not only from the rook standpoint, but also both of these pawns are getting ready to push forward here. And now White has a very interesting move to find, but he wants to make sure that the king stays disconnected from these pawns. It would be great if White could just take here on e2, but the threat right now is that the pawn captures on c1, and then White's going to lose this game. So he needs to make sure that the king stays distant and that the Black pawn here on d2 cannot capture the rook on c1. And White does this by playing the move rook to c4 check. And you can see that if Black takes here on c4, then White takes on e2, and then it doesn't really matter where Black goes. If he tries to hold on to it, that's fine. White can play king to d1, And this is stopping the king coming down to c2. And so the only real move that black has is either d3, which this is stalemate, or to play maybe something like king to b2, but then the pawn is going to fall. So we can clearly see that if the king takes here on c4, that's going to end up in a draw, which is what white's going for. The other option would be to play king to d3. Now the king is more connected to the pawns than it was even on d4, so white has to continue the same idea. Does not just want to play c3, because that's still going to connect it to the pawns, but instead plays the move rook to d4. Now this says if you want to take the material, the king can take here on e2, and the king is not connected, so if it does come back here to c3, white has the same thing as before. This is going to end in a stalemate. White king cannot move. It's not under attack. This is going to be a drawn game. This is exactly what white is going for. Now, if the king here on d3 says, I still refuse to take this material, maybe I go king to c3 here. Well, now just the king's not protecting that pawn here on e2, can take here. Probably not going to push down here to d1 because then the rook can take it. Pretty much black is forced to take this rook here, and then the king is going to take here on d2. So that was a breakdown if the pawn moves to e2 first, but let's look at d2 as well. Because the rook on f1 is not under attack like it was with black playing e2, white can now play king to f3. The rook here on f1 is still protecting this first rank. That's exactly where white wants it, but he does need to get the king involved into the game as fast as possible. Now, from black's standpoint, black really needs to get his king involved into the game here to d3. We can already see that d1 loses to the rook just taking here on d1, and if the pawn comes down here to e2, then we can also just see that the king takes here on e2, and then if maybe king to c3, then rook to d1, and the pawn is going to fall and black is going to lose this game. So black in this position has to play king to d3. Now, white really wants to get the king to e2, so he has to have an in-between move right now, and that move is rook to a1. The king here on d3 cannot move to e4 or e2. And if he moves away from this d file, then the king can come to e2, which is the optimal square for the king. Black can't push forward here with d1. He's going to lose that. If he pushes forward here with d2, then white has the move rook to a3. This is attacking the king here, and the king has a couple options. The worst option would be to move up towards the fourth rank. If he does that, then white can just take here on e2. The king can no longer come past this third rank, and this pawn is going to fall. And so black could play king to c2. In this example, rook down here to a2, and if black keeps pushing here to b1, then white can capture with this king here on e2. And it may look like, okay, well now just don't want to lose the rook, let's go ahead and capture here on d2. You always have to be thinking about what your opponent can do, because now black has the move pawn to e1, promoting to a queen. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to take with your rook here. White is just going to capture with the king here on e2. In the first few examples, we looked at what happens if black pushes the pawns, and that's exactly what black needs to do. Put maximum pressure on white. White has to play optimally just to draw the game. But this is a fragile position. If black plays his king first, white actually wins the game by playing well. Not just trying to hold on for a draw, white can win. Before we get into that, I just want to thank you so much for watching this in-game series. I am going to be putting out a ton of content. If you wouldn't mind hitting that like button, let me know that you support these videos, as well as not only subscribe, but hit that notification bell. I do want to make sure that you are aware of all the videos that I'm going to be putting out for this series. They're going to be coming out a lot more frequently than I've done in the past. Don't want you to miss anything. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Let's say that the move is king to c3. Because the rook on f1 is not under attack, white can play king to f3 here. And then how does black really continue? Well, you have the obvious moves of pawn to d2. Well, that loses to king takes on e3. That's not very good. Let's say that king comes to d2 and just says, I want to get all up in the action here. Well, now we have the move rook to h1, and it's sort of a waiting move because if the king moves away to, let's say, c2, well, then white can just start to gobble up pawns here. And let's say they play the move e2. Well, now the move king to f2 and things get trickier. The king here on d2 can't move to e3. It can't move to any of the squares on the first rank because of the rook here. So the king is forced to move back, and now the king can come to e3, critical square, because this stops more of the squares that the black king wants to go to, d2 and d4. So now maybe we see the king come to c2, and now a waiting move from white, rook to g1. You have the position right now. Black can't really do anything if, in this position right here, if they just play pawn to d2, well, now just king takes here on e2. And even if you have king to c2, you could just play rook to g1, sort of as a waiting move. They can't just push forward here, and the king can't do anything. As soon as the king moves, then just rook to d1. You're just always trying to put your opponent in the worst position possible. So let's say in this position, that the king comes to c2. We play that waiting move of rook to g1. Now they come back with king to c3 here. Now rook to c1, and where do they really go? You can see that they can't come to d4 or d2 because of our king here. They can't stay on this c file anymore. So they've got to move away. And then as soon as they move away, let's say king to b3, then white can start to gobble up the material right here. Now backing up a few moves, we've already taken a look at if the pawn comes to d2, then that fails because this leaves the pawn hanging here on e3. And king to d2 also doesn't work, the example we just looked at, but e2 makes a lot of sense. It's protected by the pawn here on d3. It's attacking the rook. As soon as our rook is under attack, we know we need to move it. Now before, in our very first example, when the king was up here on c4, we played rook to c1. That doesn't work anymore because the king can come to d2. Now, if we could play rook to c1 and the king couldn't come to d2, that would be a win, but right now it can. So that's not going to be the optimal move. Instead, white can play the move rook to h1. Now, they still can't push forward with their pawn here on e2, or with e1, and they can't just play d2 because then we would just capture their material here on e2. So they're probably going to play king to d2. Now, ideally, the white king here on f3 would like to come to e3. The reason for that is that would stop this black king from being able to come here to d2. But right now, it's occupying that square, so white has to figure out a way to get the own king here to e3 and keep the black king from coming here to d2. So, white has an in-between move of king to f2. Now, this is stopping the king here on a d2. It can't come to e3, and it still can't come to the first rank here because of the rook here. And so it's going to move. Let's say king to c2. Now, we come to king to e3. We have gotten our square, so it's always good to figure out your game plan. Figure out what squares you want your pieces to go to, especially in the endgame, and see if you can make your opponent in a position where they have no option except to move away from those squares. It's a little easier to do with a king because they can never go to a square where they're under attack. So the king can't come to the first rank. It can't come here to d2. So it's forced to move probably here to c3. And now the rook can swing over here to c1. We already talked about this is a fine square as long as the king can't come here to d2. And we're starting to block off some of the squares that the black king can come to. Can't stay on the second rank, so can't come to c2. Can't come to d2 or d4 because of the king here. So maybe king to b2 attacking our rook. But now this just loses to king to d2, protecting our rook here. And then these pawns are going to fall as well. Rook to e2 makes a lot of sense as the next move, depending on where black goes. Remember, the black king can't come to this c file anymore. So it's going to be in a tough position. Can't come down here to b1. So it's going to be playing something like king to b3, completely out of the game. and then king takes on d3. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into just this endgame right here when you look at it. If you haven't studied endgames quite a bit, it could be overwhelming at first. In this series I'm going to be going over, hopefully it makes a lot more sense. If you have some specific endgames you would like me to take a look at, feel free to send me those. But really open for ideas and feedback on this series. So again, if you wouldn't mind, please hit that like button. Thank you guys so much for watching this series. Let me know what you think. If you want me to just do a ton of these videos every single week, if you want one every day, if you want more than that, less than that, just let me know what you guys are thinking. Want to make sure that you have the content that you're looking for. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.